Welcome to the Develop Yourself podcast, where we teach you everything you need to land your first job as a software developer by learning to develop yourself, your skills, your network, and more. I'm Brian, your host. Today on the Develop Yourself podcast, I have Kylo, a senior JavaScript developer who's worked all over the world, London, Cape Town, Dubai. He went from journalism to working in web development, and he's created a really interesting learning platform, The Great Sync. And we're going to talk about JavaScript mental models today to help people get unstuck with JavaScript by visualizing the fundamentals. It's so cool. Super happy to have you on the show. And thanks for actually bringing this idea and this platform to my attention.
Hey, Brian. No, thank you. Honestly, I've had so many insights and takeaways from this podcast over the years. So I'm just so happy I can finally contribute and talk all things JavaScript and learning. Just, excited.
Me too, man. Because as you know, you're a self-taught developer. I come from a non-traditional background as well. And as you know, you meet people that are learning how to code. And one of the most difficult things they face when they're doing it is JavaScript. They learn HTML, they learn CSS, and it goes pretty well. And then they get to JavaScript and things are super tough. And what you've done is really cool, which we're going to get into soon, is how to create these mental models which help you break down and understand these concepts and internalize them. But before we get into all that, I'm really curious. I love to ask people this. How did you get into web development? You were studying journalism, and then you made a pretty big pivot into web development. How'd you do that?
Yes, I steered well clear of computer science. I did not do any coding or have any background in with computers or anything like that. I was a writer. I enjoyed writing. I studied journalism and went into media for a number of years, working in different roles. I worked as a videographer for a nonprofit organization. I did, a lot of writing, photography, social media content. And the thing with all content creation is that there is content management. And that involved WordPress. I did a lot of WordPress. I just remember getting so frustrated that I couldn't change the layouts or the designs or to do anything that I wanted. I had to rely on freelancers. And I just didn't understand freelancers. I couldn't speak their language. I didn't know what they were doing.
Yeah.
So I just said to myself, you know what? Let's just learn a little bit. Let's just, learn a little bit of HTML and CSS so I can get on the same page as them. And I think as so many of us have discovered, as soon as you, learn a little bit and you get introduced to this exciting world where you can just create stuff from nothing. I was hooked. I was absolutely hooked. And, I was just creating these designs. But then came JavaScript. And JavaScript was this massive concrete wall that I struggled to get over for a very long time. And in this sort of period, I was lucky in my current role, in the role at the time, I asked if I could do some coding bits, if they needed help with their landing page, let me actually do a little bit of the HTML at least, if I could, let me just, help where I could. And that experience I was able to leverage to get my next role, which, wasn't a web developer or anything. It was still a content creator, but they needed someone who could code or who knew some coding. That allowed me to get even more experience, and that from there I was learning React. I did some freelancing, and fast forward 6 or 7 years, and now I'm a JavaScript developer working in Dubai for a startup and doing a lot of coaching, a lot of teaching on the side, helping others who've gone through a similar journey to me, who've also faced struggles with JavaScript, using this Great Sync JavaScript mental model to help them with fundamentals.
Now, you and I, we started off with the gateway drug, HTML and CSS, which is what everybody starts off with. And things are fine, right? You're loving it. You're putting together little cute pictures and things are nice, right? You immediately see your work and the output. You write some HTML and immediately on the screen, you see what you've done. You see the result. Why do people struggle with JavaScript so much?
It is such a good question because I think so many of us have this similar experience as you described, where we have this joy of being able to, write color red and then immediately see on the screen, that paragraph change to red. You have a direct cause effect relationship, and that's very exciting, and you can build things very quickly. Obviously, CSS itself can get very complex, but the basics, it's easy to understand. JavaScript there's a lot that happens behind the scenes that you don't see. You can't see what's happening behind the scenes. You don't really see the relationships between concepts. And that's that abstraction that, you have to sort of figure out by really just console logging a lot, just means that you feel lost. There's a lot of fear with it because you don't know what's happening that you're not aware of and you don't understand it. And that fear causes anxiety.
How did you like JavaScript and what did you struggle with specifically when you were trying to learn it on your own?
Yeah, so I just remember scrambling, trying to find resources that could help me. I was really looking for anything that could reinforce all this theory that I was learning and to help tie it in. And I just remember it was one night in London and I was coming back from my first networking event. And this event had this coding challenge that, it was basically a series of questions and they had prizes and that kind of thing. And the questions started from the most basic and then got increasingly difficult. And I had already been learning JavaScript for some months by this time. Mm-hmm. And the very first question, which was super basic, it was something like, just write a function that console logs a bunch of $signs or something like that. And I couldn't even do that. I couldn't even do the first question after months of studying JavaScript. And I just remember walking back from it. It was late at night in the streets. And I was just so down and frustrated and disappointed as well. I was questioning, is JavaScript for someone like me? Actually, can I actually do this?
Yep.
And it was a low point. And, especially when you've been putting in hours, working often on the side of a job, on weekends, and you're not seeing the results. And like I say, I was really looking for other resources. My only hope was to find something that could just clear up the picture for me a bit and just make me feel a little less lost. So I was reading books. I started reading Eloquent JavaScript, which I still found difficult.
Yep, me too.
But in that book, there was an analogy of a little octopus that described variables, right? And the octopus has these tentacles, and we need to think of variables as latching on rather than putting things in. Variables are latching on to different values. And I mean, it was a basic example, but I was like, man, this is what I need. I just
started
need
to click.
Just some sort of point of reference, variables might be such a theoretical concept, but as soon as I have even a silly analogy like an octopus, it made it a lot less scary and intimidating, and B, I could visualize something, and that's what I needed. And that got me onto the route of trying to find ways of representing code and making it visual.
That is really interesting because I don't know if I consider myself like a quote unquote visual learner, but I hear a lot of people say that. Like they say, I'm a visual learner. And I think at some level we kind of all are. I mean, that's how we understand the world for the most part. We take in what we see and then we interpret it. And when you're writing code, that kind of goes away at the JavaScript level the first time you're doing it. You begin to lose that whole visual representation of things and you don't have that latch. Why do you think that visual learning was a solution for you? And maybe why is visual learning just the solution for us all? Hey, I hope you're enjoying this episode. And if you're interested in becoming a software developer, learning how to build complex software, and actually get hired, join me at Parsity.io. If you're serious about joining, just schedule a call with me by clicking the link in the show notes below.
Some people will say I prefer specific mediums of learning, but I do agree with what you said. I think ultimately, we are all visual. We rely on visual feedback. And while you might prefer reading over watching something, but at some point you will want a sort of visual representation, whether it's even just a basic diagram, or something written on a board, something to look at. And as part of your mental model as well, it's the different perspectives, right? You want different perspectives on what you're reading and what you're writing, and that perspective then gives you insight. I think when it comes to visual learning, we look for often when we say visual learning, we often think in terms of games. Like, visual learning is a game, and you can go on and play this game. And yeah, sure, that is a type of visual learning, but we can't lump all types of visual learning into gamified learning experiences. I personally, I'm not really much into games, and I wanted something that was more concrete, that actually had a closer relationship to the fundamentals, the concepts, rather than doing an action and then seeing a change on the screen. I wanted something to visualize while I was coding. So that's what got me onto the track of representing concepts visually.
That makes a ton of sense, which kind of leads us to this thing you built, which I've seen, which is really interesting. I'm having even a hard time describing it. It's like, it's not really a course. It's like it's a way to interpret JavaScript with these really unique and interesting mental models, which is the way that I think about it. But can you tell me, what is the Great Sync?
Yeah, I think it's about time that I fully explain this system now that, I refer to as the Great Sync, it's basically a unified model of all the concepts of all the major fundamental concepts in JavaScript that are each represented using landscapes, fantasy landscapes and characters, and all of those fundamentals link together. Right? They have relationships. So that was very important for me, right? I could have taken each concept and come up with an analogy for it. And that's, there is a lot of that out there. You do find a lot of analogies for explaining a specific concept, like what is a JavaScript promise? And there would be some sort of restaurant or bus analogy or car analogy, usually very overused analogies most of the time. And that can be super helpful, right? It can help you understand that specific concept and, give you a different perspective. But what I wanted was a complete picture of JavaScript. I didn't want to just focus on one little fundamental and then not know how the others fitted together, because I did realize with JavaScript, everything is connected, right?
That's right.
Closures, if you want to understand closures, you got to understand functions. If you want to understand functions, you got to understand objects. If you want to understand objects, you got to understand values and primitives. Like that, they are all interlinked, and having these disconnected analogies didn't work for me. And I also wanted it to be memorable. That was the other goal, was to make something that was easy for me to remember if I'm stuck or overwhelmed, if I'm reading some code or some documentation, to just pause, take a breath, and then think about the Great Sync and what are the pieces here? What are the layers? And the images that are colorful and usually quite unusual. They can be abstract, but they're meant to be interesting and unforgetting. If you have cars and restaurants and all of that, they all just get mixed into one thing that you remember. But
right.
I wanted something unique, that I could always recall.
It is really unique. Like what I've seen from it, I'm like, what cool examples that you use, and they make sense. And it's super valuable because, as you know, as a JavaScript developer, when you're debugging things, you're trying to figure things out, you kind of need to go back to first principles sometimes. It's like you're looking at a problem, it's likely not super unique. And when you go back and you look, okay, what is going on in this function? Why is this logging this when I expected this? And if you go back to the fundamentals often, you can kind of figure things out a lot better than just throwing things at a wall. And if you have that solid fundamental, that foundation, it can save you, whether you're in an interview, which is one of the probably main places you're going to get like pounded on this trivia and knowing how JavaScript works at a fundamental level, or at work when you're trying to debug things and working in a code base and you're thinking, okay, let me go back to the fundamentals. This is React, or this is Vue, or this is Angular. What is this really? This is JavaScript at the end of the day. That's what all this stuff is built on, really.
Exactly. And it comes down to confidence. Right?
Yeah.
It's the confidence that you have in JavaScript, and it allows you to go into an interview and say, okay, I don't know this framework, or I don't know this particular library that you're using, but I know JavaScript, and I have the confidence to be able to say to an employer, a lot of people lie, but that's, you don't need to lie. You can say, listen, with, a lot of confidence, I can say, I don't know that library, but I have a really, really good understanding of JavaScript, and I can figure it out. I will very quickly learn whatever library or framework. And also when you start the job, and, it can be very intimidating when you're reading other people's code. You're presented with this code base and you have to start making sense of it. Again, to just have something, like we said earlier, to latch onto. Okay, let's just, bring it down to, okay, what are the different elements? What are the different parts of this code? What are the fundamentals? Let me identify them, almost like put circles around them and be like, okay, so that's that, that's that. And in your mind with the Great Sync, I'm visualizing, okay, so that's how that fits together. I don't need to be scared of that. That's just implementation detail. But I can see roughly what they're doing with functions. And the Great Sync is meant to not make you think in terms of these weird visuals constantly. I'm definitely not saying, while I'm coding, I'm visualizing these fantasy landscapes the whole time. That's not it at all. It's just something to fall back to.
I like that. Kylo, do you mind taking me through an example of like one of your mental models?
I think that would help. I think that would help give you a better idea of what it is. I think it is going to be a bit weird for me because I am used to having some sort of code and the visual in front to refer to. But this is all about imagination. And hopefully I can just paint a clear enough picture without getting lost in detail. But let's just start with, okay, if we're writing some code, before we even get to what that code is, we need to picture the environment. Like, where is our code running? So let's imagine the global scope as a giant ocean. We talk about flow in programming, and the flow here is the ocean current moving in a single direction. Just like a script goes top to bottom, we have a current that's moving in one single direction. This entire ocean is created and supported by an engine that sits underneath. So literally picture an engine powering up this ocean on top of it. It's this ocean current where we find values. Like that's where we're going to encounter values. And we're going to begin with the primitives: numbers, strings, booleans, undefined, null. Picture these primitives as islands. So they're little islands in this ocean.
All right.
Now, so let's say in our script, we decide to write the number 5 literal. In an ocean of values, with all of these different little islands, we need a way of finding that specific one, that little number 5. The JavaScript engine gives us something we know as an expression. An expression is basically anything that gives us a value back. It results in a value. And we can imagine these expressions as little blue genies. Whenever we need to find values, we ask a genie. And the genie will give us the location because we have coordinates. Every island, every value has coordinates. The genie is able to give us the location. He actually points at it. He lifts his arm and is, using his finger, and he points at that island. And pointing in programming is a very important concept, and it features throughout the Great Sync. I'm always talking about pointing, but he points at values. So what about objects and functions? So we have primitives, they're islands, but what about a function? Do we imagine them as islands too? It actually wouldn't make sense because objects aren't like primitives. Their purpose is to store things, like collections of values. So we're going to picture objects and functions as ships, rather, which can take on cargo. But we can't lump islands, these values, into ships. Like, how would you fit an island into a ship?
Yeah.
So what we're going to use are the pointers. We're going to use genies. We're going to put genies inside. And each genie or property, would be the name, knows where to find a specific value. I can actually picture these genie faces in the windows along the side of the ship holding up these giant spotlights, which is what they use to shine down onto the island. Whatever property value is assigned, that's the island they would shine onto. Functions are also ships, right? But there is a difference. They don't only store genies, they also store water. Imagine them as like these wide, flat ships, kind of like an aircraft carrier, which carry a lake of water on top. That water, which is our code, our logic that we've written, there is no flow. That water is stagnant. And it's the first reason why functions are special, because they can store this logic. We don't have to run that code. It doesn't have to be in the current. We can just store it. There's a pretty key part of this model we need to include, in that these ships are actually not in the ocean with the islands. JavaScript does not store primitives and objects in the same memory place. They're actually in different data structures. So we need to separate them. We're going to picture these ships in the air. They're actually flying ships. Now, the problem is, since ships are in the air, they no longer have coordinates like an island does. Like, how do we find a function? If we write function, how do we know where that function is? We have to find it somewhere. So what JavaScript gives us is something called a reference. A reference is a special type of island that lives with the primitives with a telescope on it. The telescope can always locate the flying ship. References are like super powerful because whenever we use an object or an array or a function, we're actually using their reference. We don't deal directly with the value, we use their reference. And that means we can pass that reference around easily. When it comes to functions, we don't even need to run the water they store. We can actually just pass that function reference. Like, we can put it in an object as a method. We could pass it to another function as a callback. We just need to have the coordinates. We need to know where that reference island is with the telescope that can pinpoint that function. To complete this little visual exploration, I just want to go back to the function ship.
Okay.
So besides the genies in the windows and the water on top, there is something else. In the front of the ship, I think we call it the bow, or like right on the tip of the front of the ship.
I got
There's
you. Yep.
a torso of a magician, a sorceress. Okay, so this is a unique, almost magical ability that all function objects have. When we call a function, we can imagine we're calling the sorceress from the ship, who then invokes the function, like a wizard spell. It's a wizard's invocation. It helps you actually remember the terminology. So it's an invocation. A wizard invokes. When she invokes, we can imagine the circular wormhole that opens up, like a black hole in space,
like
outer
in the
space,
middle of
like
the ship, like where the water is in the floating ship.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, just a big open gaping hole.
Gotcha.
A black hole. Right? And this black hole has such strong gravitational pull, which is the parentheses, when we execute a function, when we write, we have these parentheses.
Yeah.
So literally picture that as the wormhole, this black hole that's opened, and it's got such strong gravitational pull that all flow stops, right? It pulls back that flow. No code below it is running anymore. So what we're talking about here is, synchronous runtime and call stacks. So there's nothing else is going to run while this wormhole is opened, while this function is executing. That function, that code that was stored on the ship, now this is going to run. This wormhole must resolve into something. For the rest of the code below it to run, that wormhole must turn into an island. It's sort of like at the start of, the universe, like the great, the Big Bang, right? It's turned into something. It's got to turn into a value. So that value could be a primitive. It could be a number. It could be a string.
Could be another function.
And it could be another function, but it's going to return the reference. So it's going to be the island with a telescope that can point to that function ship in the air that you've got to locate. We get the reference. So a function can execute and return the reference to another function. And that's actually the start of closures. When you start learning about closures, that's the first step, is to understand the idea that another function can return. And it's what makes them special and first-class citizens in JavaScript.
Man.
So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of detail that we would go into and exactly how that function logic runs. And there's a lot of parts that I didn't want to get into because it would just get a bit confusing.
Yeah, for sure.
Verbalizing it. But yeah, I hope that gives you an idea of what it looks like.
Well, there was a couple of things that stuck to me, right? Like the idea of the ship. When I picture this ship in the air, because also just the way you described it is really memorable. It's just not like something I would just think of on my own. But then me knowing JavaScript and working with it for a long time now, and here I'm like, oh, that makes sense. The wormhole brought it all together for me. That was the part where I was like, oh, now it's coming together. That was really cool. That was like a really cool little mental trip you took me on right there.
Little journey. Yeah, it is. That's really what makes it fun. And at the end of the day, learning should be fun, right? It should be effective. It must be effective. You don't want to be wasting your time. At the end of the day, we're trying to be web developers.
Yeah.
But if you can find a way to make it fun and entertaining, then that's just going to make everything a lot easier. And yeah, the thing with all of those little elements that we mentioned, like the wormhole and, the different types of ship, so those are models on their own. You would spend time analyzing each layer, each of those things separately. And there's a lot more detail. Like with an object ship, you would want to understand how prototypal inheritance works. Mm-hmm. And instead of starting a whole new analogy that's disconnected and has nothing to do with ships, we're actually going to use the same ship, the same visual that we have for an object, and then build on top of that, so that this is how we start linking those fundamentals together and connecting them and building up a bigger picture of how JavaScript works.
This continuity. As far as like the Great Sync, is this something that ultimately you see as helping people to build things, or is this a way to learn theory, or some sort of combination?
Yeah, this is actually it's a super important question. And with everyone who I teach and I coach using this system, the first thing I try and emphasize is spending all your time visualizing the Great Sync is not going to turn you into a coder. Like, I wish it would. I really wish it would, that you could read this novel, like you said. You could read a novel and just be transported into a story. Yeah, and just like think of Genies and ships, and you got it. Now you can start writing React. And it doesn't work like that. At the end of the day, if you want to learn to code, you got to spend a lot of time writing code. Like that's, you've got to write code. You've got to do exercises. You got to do projects. But we talk about mental models. I call it the Great Sync mental model for a reason, because a mental model comprises so many different sources. So the coding part is the biggest part. You need to have a lot of experience just writing code. Terrible code is fine. It doesn't have to be good code, but just writing code. But then your mental model needs other sources. It needs other perspectives. And I have a resource on my website for imagining objects, JavaScript objects, and explaining mental models. And that provides a system for you to integrate other sources of information that can help you grow your mental model. It doesn't have to be the Great Sync. I actually say podcasts are fantastic. Gives you another perspective. Reading books, teaching, talking, networking events, even interacting with people on Twitter and reading, snippets of code. All of that contributes to your mental model and gives you different perspectives, a different way of looking at code, and that is, you're not even going to realize it's happening, but it's going to start connecting the dots for you. And the Great Sync can be another source, which can help people, and it does. It gives you a nice thing to fall back to. But it's definitely not the only thing you need. You need a variety of experiences with JavaScript.
Oh, yeah. I remember going through several books, and finally something clicked for me. And when I learned recursion, when I was trying to learn recursion and do it for interviews, I'm ready to go through all these videos and all these different material. And then I finally found this something that stuck with me. You need to be exposed to many different types of mental models, potentially, or different mediums. And you'll find something that usually clicks. And you can take little bits and pieces from each one to develop your own mental model eventually, or you can just borrow somebody else's. Like there's definitely things I've read that I've just borrowed, like, oh, that's the thing that I will now associate with that particular concept. I'm glad you kind of spoke about that because that's important. You're right, and you can't just get better at JavaScript from like listening to this podcast or having these models of Genies in your heads either. And at first it feels like you're just kind of grasping at something and trying to get your foothold, and eventually it clicks. And I know that's rough for people to hear because I know people say, "Well, what's the secret? I want the secret to make it click right now." And the secret is you need to get a bunch of information and write a bunch of janky code for a little bit of time. Unfortunately, that is to becoming a developer.
Yeah, literally. I mean, if you were to picture your mental model in that stage, which I think most of us spend the majority of our time in while learning, this like crazy, chaotic, 100 Udemy courses and books and just everything trying to, figure stuff out. And it's a crazy time. It's an exciting time, a very frustrating time, as I mentioned, it was for me. And if you pictured your mental model, if we had like a representation of what your model looked like, it's probably like a canvas with hundreds of dots just scattered. And some dots are bigger than others. And, maybe you understand one part and you've got more of, a pattern in that part of the canvas, but there's big blank areas in other parts of the canvas, and it can be very messy. But over time, with experience, with variety of experiences, that picture starts to take on some sort of form and pattern. It starts to like link the dots together. And the way you think about things becomes less chaotic. It's more structured. And that just takes time. It takes time and it takes effort and, persistence. But it's very achievable. Like I said, I really thought it wasn't for me. I was on the verge of giving it up. And I think the message really is just not to give up. Just keep going. Things will fall into place. It takes time.
Totally. I didn't like JavaScript when I first learned it. I thought actually that I could avoid it and become a strictly front-end developer using only HTML and CSS and maybe a little bit of jQuery, which was still popular at the time. And I thought, that's what I'm going to do. And then my first job was a full-stack software development role where I had to like learn C#, JavaScript, and AngularJS. And I was like, oh. But then I loved it. Yeah. Then I learned to really enjoy it. But at first I thought, there's no way I can learn this at all. And it took me forever, it felt like. In retrospect, 10 years now into this career, the year and a half or 2 years I spent learning JavaScript, still not much. I've met a lot of developers, probably like, people that I see that know it really well. And I remember a couple of people said, it didn't really click for me for almost 5 years. I thought, whoa, that is pretty wild to hear. But it's like the thing, our careers last a long time. Like it'd be kind of boring actually if you figured it all out in like 6 months. You're like, oh, okay, I got it.
Yeah, you wouldn't be interesting at all. But you're right. I've had two students who've had one was 9 years and then the other one was 11 years working in the industry, already building things out, but just zero confidence in JavaScript. And as we know, everything these days, web development involves JavaScript at some point, and they're needing to use it in their jobs. They can no longer rely on their, PHP and, their old way of doing things. And they feel completely lost after 11 years, in the industry. That's a scary thing. I'm like, put the time into building your foundation. It's going to pay off for the rest of your career. It will really help you move forwards and not get to this point later on where you feel completely lost at sea.
Oh, yeah. I have horror stories about this as well, which I think a lot of us do, because as JavaScript continues just to eat up, the web and be just something you have to know nowadays, that you might as well know it at a pretty decent level, especially if you're going to work on the front end of things, because your interviews are likely going to center around it, and everything you do for the foreseeable future will be using JavaScript if you are doing anything on or near the web. We've talked a lot about the benefits of learning through the Great Sync in these mental models. Are there any dangers of learning like this?
The biggest danger is trying to find a shortcut. And that's usually, I get a lot of messages from people saying, oh, so is the Great Sync going to mean that I can learn JavaScript in like a tenth of the time? I can just do a week or two of this. And I think we all want it. I wanted it at the time, definitely. Just a quick route to just getting this, because you want to create. I think generally most of the time that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to build things. We want to build applications. We want to build websites, and JavaScript is the thing that's stopping us from doing that, and it's stopping us from applying for jobs because we don't have the confidence. And we just want a quick route. And the danger with anything visual, and this applies to games, it applies to analogies, like researching analogies, and then something like the Great Sync, is that you spend all your time in that and you're actually just not writing code. You're not actually doing the exercises. When I teach with the Great Sync, it always comes with code. Like, it's never, what I did earlier was just read out a story. That would never happen. There always has to be code next to it, because you're training to be a web developer. So there needs to be a strong association between the code and whatever you're doing, and you need to be interacting with that code. It can't just be, it just stays on your screen and you're not actually putting it into a code editor and playing around with it and console logging it and investigating and playing around. So I guess that's the danger here, is not to put in the cognitive effort, which is so important for learning.
Yeah, I think I've shared this story a few times in the podcast, but I remember one summer the first summer I was trying to learn how to code, I bought a book on HTML. Don't judge me too hard. And I read this whole book.
We all have, don't worry.
Yeah. I read the whole thing from like front to back, and I was like, done. And then I got to my computer and I'm like, wait, where do I even write the code? I'm like, I learned all this random HTML stuff, and I thought that was like how people learn stuff. I'm like, okay, you go to school, you read a book, and then that makes you kind of an expert in the thing. I thought, well, now I'm an expert in HTML, and I had zero clue where to even begin at the end of the summer. I'm like, I read this, hundreds of pages of books. But yeah, that is the most important piece of this puzzle, doing the thing and actually doing it beyond all the stuff you're
not
reading.
Learning all this theory and then not knowing even where to start writing code or where you even begin.
Yeah, I was lost in the sauce for sure. Kylo, I've really enjoyed speaking with you today. Thanks you so much for giving me a new mental model, honestly, and hopefully a lot of people out there as well. Where can people find you and learn more about the Great Sync?
So thegreatsync.com is where you can sign up, and I have a bunch of free resources there, including ways that you can build your mental model. I'm also on Instagram at devkylo. Please, direct message me. I'm always keen to chat, especially if you're struggling with JavaScript and going through a tough time. I'm always happy to have a chat. And then I am releasing on the 20th November Imagine JavaScript, which is the fundamentals course. So it's focusing on fundamentals, not necessarily building applications, but it uses the Great Sync to help you get a firm grip of all the fundamentals. And I do have a discount code for listeners of this podcast.
Very cool. Thank you.
Just develop yourself, lowercase, one word, when it's out. Yeah. Cool. Please check it out.
Sweet. Yeah, that'll be all in the show notes, by the way. So if you want to go to the show notes, you'll find all the links and things like there. Thank you so much. I really love the Great Sync and your explanation today. Really can't wait to read the book, first of all, and also begin looking more into your site, which I've found so cool. I'm like, this is the thing I wish I had back in the days when I was learning this stuff. Very cool. Thanks a lot, Kylo.
No, thank you, Brian. Thanks. It's been really great. Loved it.
That'll do it for today's episode of the Develop Yourself podcast. If you're serious about switching careers and becoming a software developer and building complex software and want to work directly with me and my team, go to parsity.io. And if you want more information, feel free to schedule a chat by just clicking the link in the show notes. See you next week.